Howdy folks, you're watching Wonder Harry. Sit tight, because today we bring you Harry's accidental magic revealed every Dursley crime to Ministry and triggered emergency custody move. Smash that like, subscribe and enjoy the ride. Chapter 1. The record. The summer had been particularly cruel. Not in the dramatic, story-worth-telling way. No thunderstorms, no dramatic confrontations with shadowy figures, no owls delivering warnings from unknown enemies. Just the ordinary grinding cruelty of Privet Drive in late July, where the days stretched long and hot, and Harry Potter was expected to fill every hour of them with work that left his hands raw and his back aching before the sun had properly set. He'd learned over 11 years of living in that house how to read the particular quality of Vernon Dursley's silences. There was the silence that meant Vernon was absorbed in the television and could be safely ignored. There was the silence that followed a particularly good meal, when Petunia had outdone herself and Vernon sat back in his chair with the satisfied heaviness of a man at peace with the world. And then there was the silence Harry had been living inside for the past 3 days, the kind that gathered weight like a storm system, pressure building in the walls of number 4 Privet Drive, looking for somewhere to break. It had started with a letter, not one of Harry's. His letters from Ron and Hermione came sporadically, and he'd learned to collect them quickly, folding them into his pocket before Vernon could see the handwriting on the envelope and find a reason to confiscate them. No, this letter had been addressed to Vernon himself, from the Smelting Summer Activity Committee, informing him with deep regret that Dudley had been removed from the prestigious summer football program following an incident involving 3 younger boys, a garden hose, and damages estimated at £400. Dudley had apparently not mentioned this. Vernon's face had gone through several extraordinary colours when he'd read it, the usual puce, then something approaching violet, then a shade Harry had never quite seen before that reminded him of the colour of certain poisonous mushrooms Sprout had shown them in herbology. And then Vernon had looked up from the letter, and his small eyes had found Harry across the kitchen, and he'd done what he always did when Dudley had disappointed him. He'd found a way to make it Harry's fault. The logic had been, even by Vernon's standards, impressively convoluted. Harry's freakishness had unsettled Dudley's natural development. Harry's presence in a normal household had created an environment of instability. Harry's letters, those bloody letters from his freak friends, had been a disruption to the household routine, and routine was the backbone of discipline, and discipline was what separated normal boys from boys who destroyed other children's property and had to be removed from summer programs in disgrace. Harry had listened to all of this with the particular stillness he'd developed over years of practice, the stillness of a person who has learned that any visible reaction, whether argument or flinching, only adds fuel. He'd kept his eyes on the kitchen floor, his hands loose at his sides, and he'd waited for the part that always came next. The part that came next was the cupboard under the stairs. Not as sleeping quarters anymore, Harry had the second bedroom now, a concession wrested from the Dursleys by Dumbledore's letter at the end of first year. But the cupboard still existed, still held within it 11 years of residue that Harry could never quite name, and Vernon used it the way a man uses a weapon he's comfortable with. 2 days of meals slid under the door. Hedwig's cage brought inside the bedroom so she couldn't go out for food, which meant Hedwig spent 2 days in a state of increasingly indignant fury that Harry found quietly comforting. At least someone in this house was allowed to be angry. On the 3rd day, Vernon had unlocked the cupboard himself, stood in the hallway with his arms folded and his chin jutting forward, and informed Harry that he would be spending the rest of the summer earning back the £400 that Dudley's behaviour, Harry's fault, let's be clear, had cost the family. "You'll start with the garden," Vernon had said. "Full dig. Petunia wants new beds along the back fence and you'll shift the compost heap while you're at it. Then the gutters need clearing. Don't look at me like that, boy, you're perfectly capable of climbing a ladder. And after that I've had a list from Mrs. Number 7 about her side of the fence, which she's been after us to repaint for 3 years, so you'll..." "No," Harry said. The word came out quieter than he intended, not aggressive, not theatrical, just a word, clear and simple, dropped into the air between them like a stone into still water. Vernon stopped talking. The kitchen was very quiet. Petunia had gone rigid over the sink, her back to both of them, her hands stilled on whatever she'd been washing. From upstairs came the distant, tinny sound of Dudley's television. "What?" Vernon said softly. "Did you just say to me?" Harry looked up. He met Vernon's eyes, something he'd spent years carefully not doing, because direct eye contact had always been classified by Vernon as a provocation, a challenge, a sign of the unnatural willfulness that made Harry such a difficult, ungrateful, abnormal child. He met them anyway. "I said no," Harry said. "I did the garden last week. I cleared the gutters in June. I'm not repainting Mrs. Number 7's fence because Dudley got kicked off his football program." The silence that followed was different from the gathering storm silence. This one had an edge to it like glass. "You ungrateful little..." Vernon started forward and Harry stood his ground, and that was when it happened. didn't feel like it had before. Magic, in Harry's experience, had always been responsive, a flash of something warm and reactive, the kind that bubbled up when fear or surprise overwhelmed him and pushed outward in whatever direction the emotion pointed. The incident on the zoo trip, the hair that grew back, the glass that vanished, those had been small eruptions, uncontrolled, almost accidental in the truest sense. This was not that. This felt like something tearing open. It started in his chest, a pressure he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the sound of a clock in a room you sleep in. And then Vernon's hand connected with the side of Harry's face, a cuff that sent him sideways into the kitchen counter, and the pressure didn't release outward. It released everywhere. Light poured out of Harry like a door thrown open in a dark house. It wasn't golden or white or any of the colors magic had looked like at Hogwarts. It was every color at once, or no color at all, something the eye registered as light without being able to settle on what kind. It filled the kitchen, washed over Vernon and Petunia, and the cupboard under the stairs and the single window above the sink with its cheerful yellow curtains, and for one impossible moment, the entire house felt like the inside of something being read. Because that was what it was, though Harry wouldn't understand it until later. His magic had decided to tell the truth. Not just the truth of tonight, not just the cuff to the head and the 3 days in the cupboard, and the list of unpaid labor, all of it. Every locked door and missed meal and bruise carefully placed where no teacher would see it. The letter that had gone home when Harry was 7, asking whether everything was all right at home because he'd fallen asleep in class 3 days running, and the reply Vernon had written in his careful, respectable handwriting, assuring the school that Harry was a troubled child who sometimes invented stories for attention. The Christmas when Dudley had received 37 presents, and Harry had received a single pair of Vernon's old socks with the holes inexpertly darned. The summer Harry was 9 and Vernon had decided the cupboard needed repainting, and Harry had spent a week in it breathing paint fumes because there was nowhere else for him to go, all of it. Every piece of evidence, every memory, every incident recorded with the merciless precision of magic that had been storing information like pressure behind a dam for 11 years. And it broadcast every single word of it directly to the Ministry of Magic's Underage Monitoring Office at precisely 9:47 in the evening. Mafalda Hopkirk was not supposed to be in the office at 9:47 on a Wednesday evening. She was supposed to be at home, where her dinner had already gone cold and her cat, Mr. Whiskers, was probably knocking things off shelves out of spite. She was only here because the monitoring department's quarterly compliance review was due at the end of the week, and she'd fallen behind, and the paperwork wasn't going to complete itself. And honestly, if she heard one more word from that insufferable man in oversight about her department's filing backlog, she was going to hex something she'd later regret. The quill had been scratching away steadily at the compliance forms when the monitoring orb, a large crystal sphere the size of a pumpkin that sat in the center of the main monitoring desk and tracked all instances of underage magic use in Britain, went absolutely haywire. Mafalda had seen the orb behave oddly before. It pulsed when a magical child had an accident. It rang a small silver bell once when the magic was significant enough to warrant follow-up. She had never, in 14 years working in the Underage Monitoring Office, seen it do what it did at 9:47 on that particular Wednesday. It exploded with light. Not literally, the sphere remained intact, though it later had to be replaced because the magic had burned itself into the glass so deeply that it never returned to its normal milky opacity, and instead played the recorded evidence on a loop that the replacement techs found deeply upsetting. But the light it threw outward filled the entire office, and the silver bell rang not once but continuously, and the quill that normally recorded incidents began writing so fast that parchment was spooling out of its housing and piling on the floor around Mafalda's desk in great coiling loops. Mafalda stood up from her chair so quickly that she knocked it over. She stood in the middle of the output, snatching pieces of parchment at random, reading them with the color draining from her face in stages, the way water recedes from a shore before a wave. She read for 6 minutes. Then she picked up the ministry's emergency communication mirror from the hook by the door where it lived for situations too serious for memos, and she said a name she had never had personal cause to say before: Amelia Bones. Amelia Bones answered on the second pulse because she was that kind of person. She was still in her office as well. She was always still in her office, a fact that her staff noted with equal parts admiration and concern. She was a broad-shouldered woman with close-cropped grey hair and square glasses that she wore with the same air of authority with which she wore everything else, as though objects in her vicinity understood they were expected to be useful. She'd been reading the latest surveillance report on a suspected dark artifacts ring operating out of Edinburgh when the mirror pulsed. Hopkirk, she said, recognizing the younger woman. "What? You need to come to the monitoring office," Mafalda said. Her voice was doing something complicated. "Right now, please. I don't know how to describe it to you over the mirror, ma'am. You just need to come and see." Amelia Bones had been head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for 6 years. In those 6 years, she had received emergency calls about dark objects, rogue curses, suspected Death Eater activity, a dragon loose in Aberdeen, and once, memorably, a situation involving a misapplied Engorgio charm and the Prime Minister's rose garden. She had developed a reliable sense for distinguishing between crises and near crises, and the kind of panicked incompetence that masqueraded as emergencies. Mafalda Hopkirk's face in that mirror was not incompetence, it was the look of someone who had seen something they desperately wished they hadn't. Amelia put down her report and reached for her cloak. She was in the monitoring office 4 minutes later, and Mafalda Hopkirk thrust a stack of parchment into her hands without preamble, and Amelia stood in the middle of the room with light still pulsing from the overloaded orb and read. She read for considerably longer than 6 minutes. She read with the expression of a woman who has trained herself over a long career in law enforcement not to show what she is feeling on her face, and the fact that she failed to maintain that expression for more than 2 pages was something Mafalda would remember for the rest of her life. When Amelia finally looked up, her voice was very level. "This is Potter," she said, not a question. "Harry James Potter." "Yes, ma'am, 11 years old. He turned 12 in July." Amelia set the parchment down on the desk with care, the way you set down something fragile. She turned to look at the orb, which was still throwing its terrible light across the ceiling in slow, cycling waves. And none of this, she stopped. She tried again. Was there any previous notation in the monitoring records? Any prior incident flagging? Mafalda hesitated, and the hesitation was its own answer, and Amelia's eyes sharpened. "Find me every monitoring record we have on Harry Potter," Amelia said. "From birth, every notation, every incident flag, every non-event report. I want them on my desk before midnight." "Ma'am, there's more, the nature of the discharge. Our analysts will need to classify it, but it's not standard accidental magic. The orb's categorization matrix keeps," Mafalda gestured at the parchment still rolling from the quill, "it keeps classifying it as a memory extraction and evidence broadcast. Class 7 emotional overflow. It's a category we've never actually had triggered before. It's technically listed in the monitoring taxonomy as theoretically possible," Amelia said quietly. "When a magical individual under sustained extreme duress undergoes a critical threshold event, and their magic acts as an autonomous recording mechanism." She'd read the theoretical literature. She'd read it as a curiosity, an academic footnote. "Who else has seen this tonight?" "Just me, ma'am." "Keep it that way until I tell you otherwise." Amelia picked up her cloak again. "I'm going to Privet Drive." Should I call the minister's office?" Amelia paused at the door. The look she gave Mafalda was not unkind, but it was very direct. "Not yet," she said. "No," and she left, and the orb pulsed, and Mafalda stood alone in the office reading things that should never have been allowed to happen to anyone. Number 4, Privet Drive, was a very ordinary house. That was the first thing Amelia noticed, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. It sat on its neat plot of suburban land, with the careful blankness of a house that has been maintained, to say nothing about its occupants. Tidy garden, respectable curtains, a car on the drive that announced competent income without extravagance. A house that wanted, very badly, to be unremarkable. She arrived to find the street already disrupted. The light from Harry's magical discharge had apparently been visible through the kitchen window as a brief but unmistakable blaze of coloured light, and 2 neighbours had called the fire brigade, and the fire brigade had arrived to find no fire but a great deal of confusion, and now a small crowd of people in dressing gowns were standing on the pavement in the warm July night looking at number 4 with the specific, uncertain energy of people who have decided something interesting might happen. Amelia walked through all of it with her warrant card held in a way that discouraged questions. It didn't say Ministry of Magic. Obviously, it said something about special investigations that Muggles generally chose not to examine too closely, and knocked on the front door of number 4 Privet Drive. Vernon Dursley opened it. He was a large man, red-faced and heavy through the shoulders, and Amelia had read enough in the past hour to look at him and feel something cold settle in the base of her stomach. He was looking at her with the aggressive suspicion of a man accustomed to answering his door in a position of social superiority, and the expression sliding over his face now, the one that said, "Who are you and what gives you the right?" nearly made her say something she'd have needed to be more careful about. "Mr. Dursley," she said. "I'm here regarding your nephew." Something shifted in Vernon's face, something complicated, a flicker of calculation underneath the bluster. "Harry," he said. "What's the boy done now?" "That," Amelia said pleasantly, "is exactly what I'm here to discuss." "May I come in?" She didn't wait for him to say yes. She walked past him into the front hallway, noted the photographs on the wall, a wail of a boy in various stages of oversized youth, beaming from every frame, not a single image of anyone who might have been Harry Potter, and turned left into what she correctly identified as the kitchen. Harry was standing at the kitchen counter. She'd looked at the monitoring records and the Hogwarts enrollment photograph before coming here, so she knew what to expect in theory, small for his age, dark hair, glasses. What she hadn't expected was the calm. He was 12 years old and he'd just produced a Class 7 magical discharge, and there was a mark along his jaw that was already darkening, and he was looking at her with a steadiness that was not the steadiness of a child who was fine. It was the steadiness of a child who had learned, very thoroughly, how to not show that he wasn't fine. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Harry," she kept her voice even. "My name is Amelia Bones. I work for the Ministry of Magic." "How are you feeling?" "Okay," he said, which was the automatic answer of someone who'd given that answer so many times it had lost connection to the truth. "Harry," she looked at his jaw. "Did Mr. Dursley strike you this evening?" Harry looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was working through a calculation she recognized, the calculation of someone deciding whether honesty was worth what it might cost them. Then something seemed to shift and he said simply, "Yes." Behind her, Vernon made a noise. "Now look here, Mr. Dursley." Amelia turned, and her voice carried the particular quality she'd spent 20 years developing, the quality of a woman who has arrested people significantly more dangerous than a suburban man with a loud voice and a fondness for his own authority, and who is not remotely impressed. "I would strongly advise you to say nothing at this moment, nothing at all. That would be the wisest choice you make this evening." Vernon opened his mouth. He looked at her face. He closed his mouth. Petunia Dursley was in the kitchen doorway, pressed against the frame with her hands twisted together, and her face was doing something that might have been fear or might have been calculation or might have been the specific expression of a woman who has always known on some level that this evening was inevitable. Amelia looked at her for one long moment, then she turned back to Harry. "I need you to come with me tonight," she said. "You're not in any trouble, you've done nothing wrong, but I need to take you somewhere safe and I need to do it now." "Is there anything you need to pack?" Harry blinked. It was, she thought, the most visibly surprised she'd seen him, not frightened, not uncertain, just genuinely caught off guard, as though the concept of someone removing him from this house in response to something done to him rather than something done by him was so foreign it needed a moment to process. "Hedwig," he said, "my owl. And my school things. Of course, go and get them, take your time." He left the kitchen and his footsteps went up the stairs without hurry, and Amelia turned to face the Dursleys. "I'm going to be very clear with you," she said. "What happened this evening has generated a ministry record. That record is comprehensive, detailed, and it covers an extensive period of time. I'm not going to discuss the specifics of what happens next while Harry is in the house. But I want you to understand that I have seen the record, and I would very seriously recommend that you make no attempt to contact Harry's school or any other agency before you hear from my office." She paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Petunia's hands had gone white-knuckled against each other. Vernon was very still, which was itself remarkable. Vernon Dursley in stillness was a fundamentally different creature from Vernon Dursley in bluster, and the stillness was not comfortable to look at. It was the stillness of a man trying to calculate his way out of something, and finding the numbers weren't working. "He's freakish," Vernon said finally, and it came out less like aggression and more like a man reaching for an argument he'd always relied on, and finding it no longer had the weight he'd counted on. "He's always been unnatural, and whatever those instruments of yours have picked up, it'll be down to that, down to him." "The record," Amelia said, "is very thorough. Mr. Dursley, I know exactly how long Harry lived in that cupboard." She let that land. "I know what he was fed when he lived there. I know about the locks on his bedroom door and the cat flap and the summer he was 9. Her voice was perfectly steady. "So I'd encourage you not to invest too much hope in the idea that this is in any way Harry's fault." The kitchen was absolutely silent, except for the sound of Hedwig moving in her cage upstairs, and the distant voices of the neighbors still milling about on the pavement outside. Harry came back down 12 minutes later with his trunk levitated, neatly beside him, and Hedwig's cage in his hand, and his school bag over one shoulder. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the Dursleys, and the Dursleys looked at him, and the silence between them contained 11 years of everything that had never been said. "By then," Harry said. Vernon said nothing. Petunia said nothing. Harry looked at them for one more moment, not with anger, not with triumph, just with that unnerving calm, and then he walked out of number 4 Privet Drive, and the door swung shut behind him with a sound that felt to everyone present considerably more final than a door closing usually does. Outside, the fire brigade was beginning to wrap up their investigation of the nothing wrong at number 4. Harry set Hedwig's cage down on the pavement, and she regarded him with amber eyes that managed to convey both relief and offense simultaneously, the way only owls and cats can. "I know," Harry said to her. "I'm sorry about the last few days." She clicked her beak at him in a tone that suggested the apology was accepted but would not be forgotten. Amelia Bones appeared beside him, directing 2 ministry officials who'd arrived during her time inside. They were already managing Harry's trunk with the quiet efficiency of people who handle emergency extractions regularly, which Amelia had ensured they would be, because she'd sent ahead while still in the kitchen. "Where are we going?" Harry asked. For tonight, there's ministry emergency housing. It's clean and comfortable, and you'll have everything you need. Tomorrow, I'll need to speak with you properly, and then we'll arrange something more permanent while the investigation is underway." "What investigation?" Amelia looked at him. He was looking back at her with that same directness he'd shown in the kitchen, a directness that didn't read as challenge or defiance, just as someone who had stopped pretending not to understand things. "Into what's been happening in that house," she said, "into what's been done to you, and into why it was allowed to continue for as long as it did." Harry absorbed this. He looked back at number 4, Privet Drive, which sat on its plot with all its careful ordinariness, its tidy garden, its respectable curtains. From somewhere inside came the sound of a television being turned on. Dudley, probably, in his bedroom, entirely unaware that the gravitational center of his household had just shifted irrevocably. "The magic," Harry said. "What it did tonight, did it? I didn't do it on purpose." "I know," Amelia said. "It's a phenomenon called an evidence broadcast. Your magic acted as an autonomous recorder. It's documented everything." She paused, watching his face. "I want to be honest with you. The record your magic generated tonight is the most comprehensive piece of evidence I've encountered in 20 years of law enforcement. It's not something that can be dismissed or buried or quietly managed. Do you understand what I mean?" "You mean people are going to know?" Harry said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Hedwig shuffled on her perch. The fire engine was pulling away from the curb. A neighbor in a dressing gown caught Harry's eye, then quickly looked away. "Good," Harry said. It was said without heat, without drama, just with the flat, clean certainty of someone stating a fact they've known for a very long time and are finally, for the first time, allowed to say out loud. Amelia Bones looked at him, and something in her expression, behind the square glasses and the professional composure, shifted into something like respect. "All right," she said. "Let's go." Albus Dumbledore received the letter at 11:53 that night. He was at Hogwarts in his office, with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, and a letter from the Ministry's Underage Monitoring Department that sat in the center of his desk, with the specific quality of something that cannot be unread. Fawkes was watching him from his perch with the patient, sorrowful attention of a phoenix who has seen several centuries' worth of human miscalculations and has learned to hold them without commentary. Dumbledore read the letter once. Then he set it down and sat for a long moment with his hands folded in front of him, looking at nothing in particular, while the portraits of his predecessors, the wise, the foolish, the ruthless and the kind, either slept their painted sleep or pretended to very convincingly. "I see," he said to no one. He picked up the letter and read it again. It was from Amelia Bones, and it was 2 pages long, and it was written in the brisk, precise hand of a woman who had chosen every word carefully and still let the anger come through the spaces between them. It informed him that Harry Potter had been removed from his placed residence under emergency custody provisions. It informed him that a ministry investigation had been opened under sections 12 through 22 of the Magical Child Protection Charter. It informed him that as Harry's designated magical guardian of record, he would be required to present himself before the DMLE within 48 hours to provide a formal accounting of the placement decision and any magical protections, monitoring arrangements, or oversight structures he had or had not put in place. And it informed him, in a final paragraph that was shorter and colder than everything preceding it, that the evidence generated by Harry Potter's accidental magic discharge that evening was being treated as a criminal record, and that persons with knowledge of the conditions at 4 Privet Drive, Surbiton. He stopped. Surrey, he thought, not Surbiton. Amelia had always been terrible with suburban geography. It was an absurd thing to notice. He noticed it anyway because some part of his mind was doing what it always did under pressure, retreating to the manageable, the fixable, the small, while the larger part sat very quietly with the letter and understood with perfect clarity what the next several weeks were going to mean. He had made a calculation. He had made it 11 years ago in the smoking ruins of Godric's Hollow, with a boy asleep in his arms and the weight of a war finally, bloodily over, and Petunia Dursley's address in his coat pocket. He had made it understanding that the blood protection required sacrifice, that the sacrifice would be borne by a child who had not consented to it, and that this was the nature of war, that the pieces it moved did not always survive the moving unharmed, and that survival of a larger kind sometimes required toleration of smaller cruelties. He had known. Not the specifics, not the cupboard, not the locks, not the particular quality of what Amelia's record would describe. But he had known that a house where Harry was unwanted would not be a house where Harry was happy, and he had left him there anyway because the protection was real and the threat was real, and the alternative had seemed in his calculations like a greater risk. The calculations had been sound. He was still, even now, confident that the calculations had been sound. He was also, in a way that had nothing to do with calculations, sitting in his office at midnight with a letter from Amelia Bones and feeling very old. Fawkes made a soft sound from his perch, not a trill, something quieter, the sound a phoenix makes when it's deciding whether to offer comfort. "Not tonight, old friend," Dumbledore said. He set the letter down and picked up a quill and began to write his reply. Harry lay in the Ministry emergency housing room at midnight and looked at the ceiling. The room was clean and surprisingly comfortable, plain, Ministry issue, but with decent bedding and a window that looked out over the Thames, where London was still doing its usual London things without any awareness that anything significant had happened that evening. Hedwig had been given a perch and a small dish of water and had settled into a ruffled, watchful sleep that looked more like vigil than rest. Harry's face hurt where Vernon had hit him. It didn't hurt badly, he'd had worse, plenty worse, but it had a specific, insistent quality, the kind that keeps you honest in the small hours when you're trying to believe that things are fine. He was thinking about the light. He was thinking about the way it had felt from the inside, not like something leaving him, but like something completing a circuit, magic connecting to memory, connecting to something he didn't have a word for. He'd been doing accidental magic since before he knew what magic was. He'd been reacting his whole life, magic sparking out of him in directions he couldn't predict or control, and he'd spent the first 11 years of his life being punished for it, and the next one being taught to direct it, shape it, make it deliberately useful. He was getting better at that, he could feel himself getting better, but tonight hadn't been reaction. Tonight had been something else. His magic had looked at the situation and made a decision. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He was sure how he felt about the decision it had made. He thought about Amelia Bones saying the most comprehensive piece of evidence I've encountered in 20 years. He thought about Vernon's face when she'd said the thing about the cupboard. He thought about the door swinging shut behind him with that final sound. He thought, I'm not going back, not as a wish, not as a desperate hope of the kind he'd allowed himself before and learned to be careful of, the kind that was soft enough to hurt when they dissolved. As a statement of fact, a recognition of something that had shifted in the world tonight, shifted in a way that couldn't be unshifted, and that the shifting had a direction that led, for the first time he could remember, away from Privet Drive rather than back to it. Something in his chest unclenched, just slightly, just enough. Hedwig opened one eye, regarded him for a moment, and then closed it again with the air of a creature who has delivered her point without needing to elaborate. Yeah, Harry said softly, I know. He closed his eyes. The Thames moved outside the window, patient and dark and indifferent to the particular significance of this particular night, which was fine. Harry had never needed the world to understand what was significant. He just needed occasionally for someone to act on it. Someone had. He slept. At number 4 Privet Drive, Vernon Dursley sat in the kitchen with all the lights on and the letter from the Ministry, which he'd found slipped under the door while Harry was packing, and read it 3 times trying to find the part where it was a misunderstanding. Petunia sat across from him with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the table, and said nothing at all, which was more frightening to Vernon than anything she might have said. Upstairs, Dudley's television had gone quiet. Whether he was asleep or just listening wasn't clear. The letter was from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and it was signed with Amelia Bones' name, and it used the words formal investigation and criminal charges in both wizarding and muggle jurisdiction, which had required Vernon to read it twice before the phrase registered properly, and then required him to sit very still for a while after it did. The garden was quiet through the kitchen window. The plants that Harry had tended through June were still tidy, still properly arranged. The new beds Petunia had wanted along the back fence sat unturned. Vernon picked up the letter and put it down and picked it up again. Petunia, he said finally. She looked at him. Her face was stripped of its usual careful social presentation, no performance of the good neighbor, the good wife, the perfectly normal woman living a perfectly normal life. Just her face, older than it looked in daylight, and a knowledge behind her eyes that had always been there, and that Vernon had never, in 20 years, directly acknowledged. She knew she'd always known what Harry was, what he meant, what the letter that Dumbledore had left on the doorstep the morning of November 2nd, 1981 had actually been telling her, and she'd chosen every day since to choose her ordinary life over her sister's extraordinary child, and the choosing had been easy until it wasn't. They'll know everything, she said, her voice was very quiet. It's all lies, Vernon started reflexively. Vernon, she said his name like a door closing. They said the magic recorded it, all of it. She looked at her hands. It recorded all of it. The kitchen was very quiet. Vernon set the letter down on the table between them and looked at it, and the thing he was looking at wasn't really the letter at all. Chapter 2, The Weight of Evidence. Harry woke up to the smell of toast. It was such an ordinary thing that his brain didn't know what to do with it for a moment. He lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room, and his body ran through its usual morning inventory before his mind caught up. Ceiling was wrong. Pillows smelled like ministry-issue linen detergent instead of damp and old wood. The light through the window was London grey rather than the particular suburban white of Privet Drive in summer. Then it all landed and he sat up. Hedwig was already awake, watching him with the specific attention of an owl who has been awake for some time and has developed opinions about the situation. Someone had refreshed her water dish, and left a small brown bag of owl treats on the perch stand. Harry looked at it for a moment, then pulled on his glasses and picked up the bag and offered her one, which she accepted with great dignity. "Morning," he said. She clicked her beak softly. "Yes, it is. We are not at Privet Drive. I am choosing to view this development favorably." The toast smell was coming from under the door, down a corridor, through what turned out to be a small common kitchen with 2 ministry employees already moving through it, with the practiced efficiency of people running on early shifts and competence rather than enthusiasm. One of them, a young woman with close-cropped brown hair and ink on her left hand, looked up when Harry appeared in the doorway and gave him the particular look of someone who has been briefed. "Harry, morning. I'm Dawlish's assistant, Nora." She pushed a plate toward the small table. "Toast, scrambled eggs, pumpkin juice or regular orange if you'd prefer." "Regular orange," Harry said, because 11 years of Dursley household conditioning meant he still found pumpkin juice slightly startling at breakfast. He sat down. "What time is it?" "7:15. You've got a meeting with Director Bones at 9. Until then you're free to eat, rest, whatever you need." She hesitated. "Is there anyone you'd like to contact? An owl can be arranged." Harry thought about Ron. Ron, who would be at the Burrow right now, in that cheerful, chaotic house that Harry had visited only once, but which had lodged itself in his memory, with the specific vividness of things you want very badly. He thought about writing "Something's happened, I'm okay, tell your mum I'm..." "Yes," he said, "I'd like to send a letter." He ate the eggs and the toast, ate them properly, not the way you eat when you're watching for the moment the plate gets taken away, and wrote 2 letters, one to Ron and one to Hermione, both short and factual and deliberately not alarming. "I'm not at Privet Drive anymore. Something happened with the ministry. I'm fine, I'll explain when I can." He addressed them both, gave them to the ministry owl that Nora produced, and watched it go out the window and over the Thames, and the Thames was doing its morning thing, all grey water and working boats and the distant geometry of London waking up. Then he sat and waited for 9 o'clock, which was something he was very good at. Amelia Bones's office looked like it had been designed to communicate exactly one thing about its occupant: "I'm not here to impress you." No portraits of important people, no ceremonial objects on display. Just books stacked with the organized density of someone who reads them and then reads them again. A desk with paperwork arranged in a system that made sense to no one but her. And on the wall behind the desk, a framed list that Harry could just make out as he sat down in the chair across from her. The names of DMLE officers killed in the line of duty, which wasn't decoration so much as commitment made visible. Amelia sat across from him and folded her hands on the desk. In daylight, with a night's sleep between them and the chaos of Privet Drive, she looked like someone who had been thinking hard and had arrived at conclusions she was ready to act on. "How did you sleep?" she asked. "Well," Harry said, "this one was actually true." "Good." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to be direct with you, Harry, because I think you prefer that, and because I think you've had enough of people deciding what information you can and can't handle on your behalf." Harry looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I do prefer that. What your magic did last night is significant in ways that go beyond the immediate situation. The evidence broadcast is documented, catalogued, and held in ministry record. That's permanent and it cannot be altered or expunged. What it recorded constitutes, under wizarding law, 18 counts of child endangerment, 9 counts of deliberate magical suppression through coercive means, and what our analysts are classifying as sustained psychological abuse over a period of approximately 11 years. She said it straight, not gently, the way you say something to a person you're treating as capable of receiving it. Under Muggle law, the count is considerably higher. We've been in contact with the relevant Muggle authorities already." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Muggle authorities," he said, "like the police. Yes, there will need to be a parallel process because the Dursleys are Muggles and several of the violations fall outside our jurisdiction. The 2 processes will run concurrently. The Dursleys have been formally notified that they are under investigation and are not to leave Surrey. They're still in the house, for now. We don't have grounds to remove them from their own property until charges are formally laid, which will require a hearing. That hearing will be within the week." She paused. "I want to be honest about something. This process is going to be complicated, and parts of it are going to be uncomfortable. There are people within the ministry who would prefer this remain quiet. There are political considerations around your name, your history, around who you are, and what the wizarding world has invested in that. I'm telling you this so you're not surprised when you see it." "You mean fudge," Harry said. Amelia's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes registered that he'd made the connection without prompting. "I mean the minister's office, yes, among others. And Dumbledore." It was an interesting question. Not would you like to be or would you be comfortable, but a simple, direct question about what Harry wanted, delivered as though his answer would be the deciding factor, which was so unusual that he had to take a moment to actually process it as a real choice rather than a courtesy preamble to being told what would happen. "Yes," he said. "I want to be there, then you will be." She reached for a folder on her desk. "I also need to ask you some questions. I want to be clear that nothing you say today is a deposition. That's a formal process, separate, and you'll have a magical advocate present for it. Today is just a conversation. You can stop at any point and there's nothing you're obligated to answer. She opened the folder. I want to start with something simple. Tell me about the cupboard. She asked him questions for an hour and 15 minutes. Not the way people usually asked Harry questions, not with the flinching, careful quality of someone who is already preparing to not believe the answers, not with the aggressive skepticism of someone looking for inconsistencies that would let them file it away. She asked with the precise attention of someone who is building something, taking each answer and placing it in relation to the others, and when she wanted clarification, she asked for it directly rather than circling around it. Harry answered everything. Not nervously, not with the emotional fragility of someone exposing something tender, with the flat, clear directness of someone who has rehearsed the truth his entire life without ever being asked to speak it aloud. The facts of it had always been just facts: the cupboard, the food, the locks, the work, the specific texture of being an unwanted presence in a house that wanted very much to pretend he didn't exist. He had never felt the need to perform distress about them, because the distress had always been quiet and internal and not the kind that helped anything. What he noticed partway through was that Amelia Bones was angry. She didn't show it the way most angry adults he'd encountered had: no raised voice, no displaced energy, no making himself the target of it. It was the controlled anger of someone who is furious at a situation rather than a person, and who is taking that fury and converting it, cleanly and without waste, into momentum. Every time he answered something, she absorbed it and wrote something down and moved forward, and the writing down had a quality of "this will be used" rather than "this will be filed." When they were done, she set down her quill and looked at him for a moment. "You know," she said, "most people, adults, experienced witnesses, find this kind of interview exhausting. They need breaks, they second-guess themselves, they want to know how much to share." She paused. "You didn't do any of that. The truth is easier than people think," Harry said. "You just have to not care whether people like the version you're telling." Amelia Bones looked at him for one long moment, and then she did something Harry hadn't seen her do yet. She smiled, not warmly, not professionally, but with the genuine, unguarded quality of someone who has just been unexpectedly impressed. "I'm going to assign you a magical guardian advocate for the formal proceedings," she said. "Her name is Augusta Longbottom. You may know her grandson Neville." Harry's eyebrows went up. He did know Neville was in his year at Hogwarts, round-faced and anxious and better at herbology than anyone else in the class, which Harry had noticed even before Sprout did. "I know Neville, yes. Good. Augusta has been practicing magical family law for 40 years, and she has approximately no tolerance for bureaucratic interference. She'll serve you well." Amelia closed the folder. "For the moment, I need to sort out where you're staying. The Ministry Emergency Housing is for immediate placement only. We can't keep you here past the end of the week. I have 2 options for you and I want you to choose." "What are they?" "Option 1 is a ministry-supervised temporary home. We have 3 approved families on the current register. All vetted, all suitable." She paused. "Option 2 is that I reached out this morning to a family you know. The Weasleys have offered their home. Arthur Weasley works for my department and he's been informally briefed on the situation. Molly Weasley is," she considered her word choice, "very keen to have you." Harry thought about the burrow. He thought about the way he'd felt during the one brief visit, the din of it, the warmth, the way things moved on their own and nobody thought anything of it, and everyone talked at once at meals and there was always too much food. He thought about Ron's face when he'd described it on the Hogwarts Express, apologetic for the shabbiness and entirely missing the point that to Harry shabby and warm was something from another world entirely. "The Weasleys," he said without hesitation. Amelia nodded. "I thought so. I'll arrange the flu connection." "You'll be going this afternoon." What Harry did not fully anticipate was Molly Weasley. He arrived through the Burrow's kitchen fireplace at 3 in the afternoon in a controlled cascade of green flame, with Hedwig's cage held in front of him and his trunk arriving 30 seconds later via ministry transport, and he had about 1 second of standing in the kitchen with soot on his collar before Molly Weasley said, "Oh, Harry," in a tone that bypassed all of his carefully maintained armor entirely and went directly for something underneath. She was a stout woman with red hair and an expression of absolute intention, and she crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled him into a hug that was so unambiguous in its warmth that Harry's body did something completely embarrassing. It went rigid for a moment, the way it does when a reflex kicks in that has no business being there. And then it stopped, and he stood in the middle of Molly Weasley's embrace with his arms carefully at his sides, and something in his chest doing something painful and inconvenient. "You're all bones," she said into the top of his head. "We're going to fix that. Are you hungry?" "Of course you're hungry. Sit down." "I'm fine, Mrs. Weasley. I don't." "Sit down, dear." He sat down. Ron was already at the table, wearing the expression of someone who has received major news, and is still actively processing it while trying to appear casual. He'd clearly been briefed by his father, Harry guessed, because Arthur Weasley was currently in the doorway of the kitchen looking at Harry with the specific expression of a man who works in wizarding law enforcement and has spent his career being professionally interested in Muggle artifacts and has discovered overnight that his interest in Muggles had never extended to properly imagining what certain Muggles could do to a child without any magic involved. "Harry," Arthur said, "glad you're here." "Thanks, Mr. Weasley." Arthur nodded, and the nod contained several things: apology, anger, welcome, compressed into the particular economy of a man who has decided that actions are more useful right now than words. Fred and George appeared at the kitchen door approximately 40 seconds later, with the synchronized timing of people who had absolutely been listening from the stairs. "Blimey, Harry," Fred said. "You look terrible," George said. "Thank you," Harry said. "We mean it as a compliment," Fred clarified. "It's a rough and tumble look, very heroic." "Boys," Molly said without turning from the stove, and the boys retreated to the doorway rather than the room, which was apparently the negotiated boundary of their allowed hovering. Ginny appeared briefly at the top of the stairs, took one look at Harry, turned pink in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the 9-year-old fury of someone who had received the same briefing as everyone else and had been waiting all day to say something about it, and then disappeared again. 5 minutes later she reappeared, had apparently decided that saying something could wait, and sat down at the table with a book she held upside down for the first several minutes without noticing. Harry ate. He ate properly generous portions, Molly refilling his plate before he'd consciously registered it was empty, and the kitchen was full of the sound of the burrow doing its usual thing, the enchanted clock ticking, the radio playing something off a wizarding station, Fred and George conducting a murmured negotiation of some kind in the doorway. It was, objectively, a lot of input for someone who'd spent a week in reasonable silence, and Harry sat in the middle of it and felt something he didn't immediately have a name for. Safe, he thought eventually. It felt like safe. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he ate another piece of bread and let Molly talk about the schedule for the week and didn't think about it too directly. Later in Ron's room, with Hedwig installed on the bookshelf and Ron sprawled on his bed and Chudley Cannon's posters rotating on the walls with the resigned optimism of their subjects, Ron said, "Are you actually okay?" "Yes," Harry said. Ron looked at him. Ron was not, generally speaking, someone who went in for close emotional analysis. It wasn't his nature, and Harry generally found this one of his more restful qualities. But he was also, underneath the chess strategy and the easy humor, perceptive about things that mattered to his friends, in the way of people who pay attention without making a performance of it. "Because you can, you know, if you're not." "I know," Harry said. "I am, though." "I think I actually am." Ron nodded, accepting this with the lack of fuss that was one of the best things about him. "Dad says the investigation is going to be a whole thing, like a hearing and everything. Wisengamot maybe." "Yeah. And Dumbledore's going to have to answer for placing you there." Harry looked at the ceiling. The posters rotated. A tiny Chudley Cannon zoomed in a small circle and pumped his fist. "Amelia Bones seems like she's not going to let anyone off easy. She really isn't. Dad's worked under her for years. He says she once made a senior Auror cry by asking him to explain his filing system." Ron paused. "The Auror was 3 times her size." Harry smiled, which felt strange in his face, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. "How's your family handling this? Your mum seemed..." "Mum's been furious all day," Ron said simply. "Like quietly furious, which is actually scarier than regular furious. She and Dad talked for about 3 hours last night after they got the letter, and I could hear her saying things in the kitchen, and they were very quiet, which meant she was really angry." He paused. "She burned the eggs at breakfast because she was still thinking about it." "Mum doesn't burn eggs." "She was thinking about the cupboard." Harry said nothing. "Harry," Ron sat up on the bed. 11 years in a cupboard. "It had a light by the end," Harry said, and then caught Ron's expression and held up a hand. I know what it sounds like. I'm not defending it. He thought about how to explain the way you normalize a thing that has been normal your entire life. You just live in what's true. I didn't know there was something else." Ron looked at him for a moment. "Well," he said with the particular decisiveness of someone who has decided that words are not adequate and action is better, "you know now, and you're here." So he gestured broadly at his room, at the burrow, at the general fact of the situation. Yeah, Harry agreed. They played chess for 2 hours, which Ron won comprehensively, and the chess pieces made rude comments about Harry's strategy, and Hedwig fell asleep on the bookshelf, and the burrow made its comfortable noises around them, and outside the window the Devon summer evening was coming down soft and gold over the fields. 3 floors below, Arthur Weasley sat at the kitchen table with a stack of parchment from the ministry and read through the evidence record for the second time, because the first time he hadn't quite been able to take it all in, and he was the kind of man who believed in taking things in properly. Molly was baking. She baked when she was upset, which the family had long since learned to treat as a warning system, the more elaborate the baked goods, the more significant her emotional state. Tonight's project was a 4-layer sponge cake with what appeared to be decorative magical modifications, and absolutely no occasion to justify it. The cupboard, Arthur said for approximately the 4th time that day. Molly's hands didn't stop moving. I know Arthur. He was 11 when he came to Hogwarts. 11 years he was in that house. He set down the parchment and rubbed his face. I've been collecting Muggle artifacts for 15 years trying to understand how they live without magic, and I have never. Don't, Molly said. Her voice was level in the way a pot is level before it boils. Don't do the thing where you turn it into an abstraction. It's Harry. He was upstairs an hour ago eating bread at our table. I know, Arthur said quietly. He went rigid when I hugged him. Her hands stopped on the bowl, not frightened, just unprepared. Like he didn't know what it was. Silence in the kitchen, except for the radio playing softly and the magical clock showing 7 of its 9 hands in the home position. Dumbledore placed him there, Arthur said, deliberately knowing the family. Yes, there'll need to be an accounting for that. Amelia won't let it go. Good, Molly said, in exactly the same tone Harry had used the previous evening looking at number 4, Privet Drive, for the last time. Arthur looked at his wife. He had known her for 23 years, and he was well acquainted with the particular quality of her anger, the way it ran hot in the immediate moment and then settled over time into something colder and more permanent and considerably more dangerous. This, he recognized, was the settling stage. She had decided something. Moll, he said. He's staying, she said. Not as a question, not even really as a statement to him. More as a declaration to the kitchen, to the world, to whatever institutional machinery might subsequently suggest otherwise. Whatever the hearing decides, whatever Dumbledore says, whatever the ministry arranges, he has somewhere to come back to, this house. This is where he comes, Arthur nodded. I'll talk to Amelia tomorrow. You'll do more than talk. She went back to the cake. You'll make her write it down. The meeting with Dumbledore took place in Amelia Bones' office at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, and Harry sat in the corner chair, not behind the desk, not across from it, but off to the side, slightly angled, a position he'd chosen deliberately because he wanted to be able to see everyone in the room at once without anyone's eyeline running directly through him, and watched. Augusta Longbottom was already there when Harry arrived, which was its own statement. She was a formidable woman in an extraordinary hat, wearing the expression of someone who has survived decades of ministry politics and maintained her positions through sheer force of refusal to be managed. She nodded at Harry when he came in and said, "You're taller than Neville," which was not strictly true but which he understood as a greeting of a particular kind. Dumbledore arrived precisely on time, which was somehow more impressive than arriving early and more pointed than arriving late. Harry watched him come through the door and sat with what he felt, which was more complicated than he'd expected. He had, throughout his first year at Hogwarts, regarded Dumbledore with a reverence that was partly genuine respect, and partly the understanding that Dumbledore was one of the very few adults who had ever treated him as though he mattered. He'd also, in the back of his mind, been carrying something since the Mirror of Erist, a question he'd never quite asked about why Dumbledore knew so precisely what the mirror would show Harry. Why he'd known specifically that what Harry most desperately wanted was a family. He'd known because he knew what Harry's life was. He'd always known. Dumbledore looked at Harry first, before Amelia, before Augusta, before anything else in the room, looked at him with an expression that Harry couldn't categorize, something too complex to reduce to guilt or regret or strategy, something that looked like a man seeing the distance between his intentions and their consequences, and measuring it for the first time with someone else's ruler. "Harry," he said. "Professor," Harry said. They looked at each other for one moment, and then Amelia said, "Sit down, Albus," and the meeting began. Dumbledore spoke well, he always did. He spoke about the blood protection with the measured certainty of someone presenting a thesis they have researched thoroughly, about Lily Potter's sacrificial magic, about the way it anchored itself in Petunia's line, about the theoretical and empirical evidence that it had, in fact, operated as intended and deflected attempts on Harry's life since his placement. He spoke about the war context, about the impossibility of certainty in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's fall, about the calculation required when every known safe house was potentially compromised and every wizarding family a potential target. He spoke about all of it clearly, logically, with the authority of a man who has thought about something for a very long time and genuinely believes his thinking has been sound. And when he finished, Amelia said, "When did you last visit number 4, Privet Drive?" A pause. "I have maintained indirect monitoring through. When did you last visit?" Amelia said. "Personally set foot in the house. Spoke with the Dursleys face to face." A longer pause. "The night I placed Harry there," Dumbledore said, and for the first time there was something underneath the measured authority. Something that might have been a smaller, less comfortable truth. So, Amelia opened a folder on her desk. "In 11 years, you arranged no welfare checks, no ministry oversight, no structured contact with Harry's guardians beyond letters, the magical monitoring. The magical monitoring, Augusta Longbottom said, speaking for the first time since Dumbledore had sat down, flagged 11 separate incidents of significant accidental magic at 4 Privet Drive between 1982 and 1992, and generated 11 follow-up action notifications that were each subsequently. And I am reading directly from the records here, Albus, so please don't, each subsequently filed with a notation reading placement confirmed appropriate. No action required, signed by your office. The office was very quiet. You saw the flags, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. The expression on his face was, Harry thought, the most honest it had been since he walked in. Yes, he said. And you decided they didn't need following up. I made a judgment. You knew it was bad, Harry said, not angrily, not loudly. Just flatly, with the same clarity he'd brought to Amelia's interview, the clarity of someone for whom the facts are simply facts, and who is done with performing uncertainty about them. You knew it wasn't good there, and you left me anyway because you needed me at that address. Dumbledore met his eyes, and the thing in his face now was neither deflection nor performance. It was the specific, undefended expression of a man confronted with a truth he can't improve on. Yes, he said, I did. Augusta Longbottom made a sound that was not quite a word. Amelia wrote something down. I'd like to be clear, Dumbledore continued, and his voice was quieter now, the oratory quality gone, that the blood protection was real. That it saved your life, that nothing I'm saying to mitigate my decisions changes the fact that those decisions produced a real outcome. The protection was real, Harry said, and the rest of it was also real. Both those things can be true. He looked at Dumbledore without hostility, without the crumbling edge of someone trying to hold themselves together, just looking. I'm not asking you to be sorry, I'm telling you what happened. The Ministry's going to do what the Ministry's going to do. He stopped, chose his words. I wanted to be in the room when you said it out loud that you knew. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, then he said quietly, you deserve better, Harry, much better, and I'm sorry. The apology didn't fix anything. Harry hadn't expected it to, but there was something in having it said, in having the acknowledgement exist in a room with witnesses, that settled something in him, not healed it, not undone it, just settled it. The way you settle a question by getting a definite answer even when the answer isn't the one you'd have chosen. I know, he said. Fudge tried on Friday. Harry wasn't there for it directly, but he heard about it from Augusta Longbottom over tea in her private waiting room before a secondary interview, and Augusta's account had the quality of someone reporting a particularly satisfying sporting result. Cornelius Fudge had appeared in Amelia's office at 9 in the morning with 2 aides and a deeply uncomfortable expression, and had suggested delicately, careful to maintain the language of suggestion rather than instruction, that given the sensitive nature of the situation and the particular public significance of the individual involved, it might be worth considering whether a formal investigation was truly the best path forward. Whether there weren't private resolutions that might serve all parties more. She stopped him at quietly managed, Augusta told Harry. She put her pen down, which is how you know she's genuinely angry, and she told him that she had the most comprehensive evidence record in 20 years of enforcement work sitting in her filing cabinet, and that if the Minister of Magic was standing in her office suggesting she quietly manage it, she would have the record in the Daily Prophet by Monday morning with his visit noted in the timeline. Harry sipped his tea. What did he do? He went very quiet. Then he said something about supporting the investigation, of course full support, just checking in as a matter of course. Then he left. Augusta set down her own cup. Cornelius Fudge is not a brave man. He's not particularly corrupt either, not in the dramatic sense. He's just a man who has always preferred comfort over difficulty, and he's spent long enough in power that he's forgotten there's a difference between what's comfortable and what's right. She looked at Harry over her teacup. People like that are often more dangerous than the genuinely villainous. The villainous, at least, have committed to a position. Harry thought about this. You're saying he's not fighting the investigation, he's just hoping it goes away. Precisely. Which means as long as we make sure it doesn't go away, he won't have the spine to stop it. She put down her cup with the definitive click of a woman concluding a point. Now, let's talk about the Wisengamot hearing. You're going to have to give formal testimony. I know. It will be public record. There are Wisengamot members who will attempt to challenge your account, not because they disbelieve it, but because they have political reasons to muddy it. I want you to understand this going in. People challenging my account doesn't change my account, Harry said. Augusta looked at him for a moment with an expression that reminded him slightly of Amelia's smile, genuine and a bit surprised. No, she said. I don't suppose it does. She spent an hour walking him through the formal deposition process, the structure of the Wisengamot hearing, the specific protections available to him as a minor under the Magical Child Protection Charter. Harry asked direct questions when he had them and listened without interrupting when he didn't, and Augusta confirmed her assessment of him with the private satisfaction of someone who has taken a case on and found the case worth taking. That evening, Harry stood in the Burrows garden as the light went down over Devon and did something he hadn't done since leaving Hogwarts at the end of term. He practiced magic. Not the formal, structured practice of classroom work, just free casting, magic answering intention rather than incantation, the way it responded when he let it rather than directed it. He discovered during his first year that he could do things silently that he hadn't been taught yet, that sometimes magic moved ahead of the lesson and he had to catch up with the theory. Hermione had told him, when he'd mentioned this once, that it was unusual, that most young witches and wizards needed the verbal structure as a scaffold until their control was more developed. Harry had listened and nodded and hadn't quite been able to explain that the scaffold sometimes felt like the thing slowing him down. He stood in the Weasley garden in the Devon evening, with gnomes watching him from the cabbage bed with territorial suspicion, and he worked through exercises, light movement, small transformations, nothing dramatic. Just the feeling of it, magic moving through him with the ease of something that fit, something that had always fit even when nothing else in his life had. After a while he noticed Ginny sitting on the back step watching him. "Sorry," he said, "is this weird?" She shook her head. She was 9 years old and had, Harry had gathered from various family interactions, been hearing about him since approximately birth, which was a strange weight for a person to carry and which she seemed to be managing by ignoring it aggressively in favor of just treating him like a person. He respected this. "Can you do it without the wand?" she asked. "Sometimes." He held up his hand and let a small light bloom in his palm, not a spell, just magic settling into a shape responsive and warm. "Usually just for small things." Ginny's eyes went bright with the particular intensity of someone who is very good at something and has just recognized kinship in an unexpected place. "I can do things without a wand too," she said. "Mum says it'll settle down once I start Hogwarts and learn to direct it properly." She paused. "I don't want it to settle down." "I know what you mean," Harry said. She grinned at him, not the shy, slightly overwhelmed grin of someone meeting a legend, just a grin, and went back inside. Harry stood in the garden and let the light in his hand bloom a bit larger. The gnomes watched with unimpressed attention. Somewhere inside the burrow, Molly was calling everyone for dinner, and the sound of it came through the windows along with the smell of something extraordinary. He closed his hand and the light went out, comfortable and controlled and absolutely his. He turned toward the house, toward the light spilling from the kitchen windows, toward the noise of it, the particular chaotic warmth of 6 Weasleys and 1 Harry Potter sitting down to eat. He walked inside. The owl from the ministry arrived Saturday morning with 2 pieces of news. The first was that the formal Wisengamot hearing had been scheduled for the following Wednesday. The second was that the Muggle police had made 2 arrests the previous evening at number 4, Privet Drive, Surrey. Vernon and Petunia Dursley had been taken into custody. Harry read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen counter with Hedwig on his shoulder and the smell of Molly's breakfast filling the room. He put the letter down. He picked up his orange juice. He stood for a moment looking out the kitchen window at the Devon fields, and Hedwig shifted on his shoulder and made a soft sound. "I know," he said. He'd thought he'd feel more. He'd thought there'd be something dramatic, relief or triumph, or the specific ache of a wound finally being acknowledged. There was something, but it was quieter than any of those things. It was the feeling of a mechanism completing its rotation, a gear turning into the right position. They'd always been able to do whatever they wanted to him because there were never any consequences. That had always been the simple mechanism of it. Not monsters, just ordinary selfish people who had been given a child they didn't want and a world that would never look too closely at what they did with it. Someone had looked. Molly appeared at the kitchen doorway, took one look at his face and the letter on the counter, and came and stood next to him without saying anything. Just stood there, which was its own kind of statement, the statement of a person who understands that some moments need presence more than they need words. After a while Harry said, "Thank you for all of this, letting me stay here." "Harry," Molly's voice had that quality again, the one that bypassed things. "You don't thank family for existing." The word landed in the kitchen between them, simple and enormous. "Family." Harry looked at his orange juice. "Okay," he said. His voice was not entirely steady, which was fine. Some things didn't need to be. Chapter 3, The Reckoning Wednesday arrived the way significant days always do, without ceremony, without the weight the calendar had given it. Harry woke before dawn to the sound of rain on the burrow's roof, a sound he'd already started associating with being warm inside rather than wondering about the state of Petunia's garden beds. He lay in the dark listening to it for a while, then got up and dressed without waking. Ron Hedwig was awake. She watched him pull on the dress robes Molly had taken him to get in Diagon Alley 2 days prior, a necessary purchase that had involved Molly in fierce negotiation with the robes shop's proprietor over quality cut, and what she called appropriate gravitas for a boy giving formal testimony, which had been both mortifying and quietly wonderful. "Stop looking at me like that," Harry told Hedwig. She clicked her beak in a way that suggested the robes were an improvement, and she was choosing to be magnanimous about the fact that it had taken this long. Downstairs, Molly was already in the kitchen. Of course she was. The clock showed 3 hands in the traveling position, Arthur, Percy and Fred or George, Harry couldn't tell which, and Molly was making porridge with the focused energy of someone who has decided that feeding people is the most useful contribution she can make to the current situation. "Sit," she said when Harry appeared. He sat. She put porridge in front of him, then tea, then a plate of toast, as though one carbohydrate was insufficient armoring for the day. She sat across from him while he ate and didn't chatter, which he appreciated. She just drank her tea and let him exist in the morning with her, which was, he was beginning to understand, a very specific and deliberate form of care. "Ready?" she asked when he'd finished. "Yes," he said, and he was. That was the thing he noticed as he said it, no performance in it, no convincing himself. He was actually genuinely ready in the way of someone who has been carrying a story for 11 years and has finally been asked to tell it somewhere that counts. The Wizengamot chamber was older than most of the ministry building around it, and it showed. The stone walls held the particular cold of spaces that have absorbed centuries of consequential things, and the tiers of seating arranged in a circle around the central floor gave the room the quality of a theatre designed for a play no one was entirely comfortable staging. 51 witches and wizards in plum-colored robes occupied those tiers, most of them with parchment in front of them and expressions calibrated to appropriate gravity. Harry walked in with Augusta Longbottom on his left and Amelia Bones on his right, which felt, he thought, like being flanked by artillery. The room did what rooms sometimes did when he entered them, a small, electric shift of attention, the particular quality of a space noting that someone significant had arrived. He didn't acknowledge it. He walked to the central floor and stood, and looked around at the assembled Wizengamot with the equanimity of someone who has decided that rooms full of people are not inherently threatening. Dumbledore was seated in the upper left tier. He met Harry's eyes briefly, then looked away. He was not presiding today. Amelia had confirmed that the Chief Warlock's position was technically his, but that he had voluntarily recused himself from this hearing given his direct involvement, a decision she described as the first piece of good judgment in this situation, and notably about 11 years too late. Chief Witch Griselda Marchbanks was presiding. She was extraordinarily old, small and upright, with the expression of someone who has seen every variety of human failing and rates them purely on whether they were interesting. In the gallery above the public entrance, Harry could see the distinctive red hair of several Weasleys. Molly had her arms folded. Ron was leaning forward with his elbows on the railing and caught Harry's eye and gave one firm nod. Ginny was sitting very straight with her hands in her lap. Hermione, who had arrived at the Burrow by flu that morning, was next to Ron with a scroll of notes she'd been writing since the previous day, because Hermione prepared for things by understanding them thoroughly and having everything written down. Harry nodded back at Ron and faced the chamber. The formal hearing had 3 parts, and the first was procedural, the reading of the evidence record, which a ministry clerk performed in a flat voice that somehow made the accumulated facts worse rather than better, the monotone giving everything the quality of a ledger entry, ordinary and irrefutable. Some members of the Wizengamot made notes. A few had expressions that shifted as the reading went on. One older witch in the 3rd tier went very still at the part about the cupboard and stayed still for the rest of the reading. When it concluded, Griselda Marchbanks said, "Mr. Potter, you are here to give testimony regarding the events recorded in the ministry evidence document. You've been advised of your rights under the Magical Child Protection Charter." "Yes," Harry said. "You understand that your testimony is being given under oath in a formal proceeding, and that the Wizengamot will subsequently vote on the charges laid against the named respondents." "Yes." "Then please begin when you're ready." Harry had sat with Augusta for 2 days preparing for this. They'd walked through the structure together, the specific legal frame, the questions he'd be asked and the manner in which he should answer them, clearly, concisely, without embellishment, because embellishment gave opposing counsel room to work and the facts alone were sufficient. He'd listened to all of it with the attentiveness he gave to anything that seemed useful. And then, standing on the central floor of the Wizengamot chamber, he found that what he wanted to do was simply tell the truth in the order it had happened, which had always been, he thought, the only way to tell it. He started from the beginning, not from Privet Drive specifically, but from what he'd known of himself growing up, the way the cupboard had been explained to him as deserved, the way his strangeness had been presented as a kind of moral failing rather than what it actually was, the way he'd spent 11 years interpreting his own existence as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cared for. He described the specifics the evidence record had catalogued, and he described them without affect, not because he didn't feel anything, but because the facts were sufficient, and he was done performing distress for audiences who needed it packaged before they could receive it. He talked for 20 minutes without interruption. The chamber was extraordinarily quiet, not the quiet of boredom or impatience, but of people listening with the specific attention of those who understand they are being given something true. When he finished, Griselda Marchbanks said, "Thank you, Mr. Potter." She said it with a weight that suggested she meant something more by it than procedure. Then the questioning started. Most of it was straightforward, Amelia's people asking clarifying questions, building the formal record, closing gaps. 3 members of the Wizengamot asked procedural questions about specific incidents in the evidence timeline. Harry answered everything directly without hedging, without the careful vagueness of someone managing multiple audiences. The facts were the facts and he had always known them, and there was a specific, clean satisfaction in being asked about them by people whose job was to do something with the answers. The difficult part came from Tiberius Ogden. He was a heavyset man in the second tier, with a round, florid face and the particular energy of someone who has decided he's going to ask the hard questions that everyone else is tiptoeing around, which usually meant he'd decided he was being brave when he was actually being obstructive. Mr. Potter, Ogden said, leaning forward in his seat, I want to address what some members of this chamber might be thinking but haven't said. The evidence record is significant. No one here is disputing that. But I'd like to put it to you that there's a distinction between a household that was inhospitable and one that constitutes criminal neglect under either wizarding or muggle law. You attended Hogwarts. You were clearly fed, clothed, educated in the muggle system. Isn't it possible that what the evidence record documents is a family who did their legal minimum under difficult circumstances rather than... The legal minimum, Harry said pleasantly, was 11 years in a cupboard under the stairs. A sound from the gallery, not quite laughter, something more like the involuntary exhale of a room that has heard something that stripped away 3 layers of legal language in a single sentence. Ogden's face reddened. The cupboard situation was addressed when you were, at some point, your accommodation was moved to, when I was 11, when a letter arrived from Hogwarts addressed to the cupboard under the stairs. Harry looked at Ogden with the same directness he'd used with everyone else in this chamber. The Hogwarts sorting quill addresses letters to where you live, Mr. Ogden. When that letter arrived, the Dursleys moved me to a bedroom, not before. He paused. The legal minimum you're describing, the clothing and schooling, those were provided because a child not attending school creates official questions and the Dursleys didn't want official questions. That's not care. That's management of risk to themselves. Ogden opened his mouth and closed it again. Next question, said Griselda Marchbanks, in a tone that suggested Tiberius Ogden's next question had better be considerably better than that one. There was one more challenge, not from a Wizengamot member but from a wizard Harry didn't recognize, who turned out to be legal counsel for Vernon Dursley, and who submitted a formal objection on the grounds that the evidence record constituted magically obtained information, and should therefore be inadmissible under the non-cursive evidence protocols. Augusta Longbottom was on her feet before he'd finished the sentence. The evidence was not obtained through directed magic, coercion, or legal process, she said, with the precision of someone who has been practicing family law for 4 decades and has very little patience for incorrect citations. It was generated autonomously by a minor's accidental magic in response to a physical assault. Under Charter Section 41, autonomously generated magical evidence is admissible as primary record. The relevant case law is Pemberton v. Ministry 1962 and Ray Hartley Children 1978, both of which I suspect counsel is aware of and chose not to mention. The counsel sat down. Augusta sat down. Harry did not look at either of them but felt privately the specific warmth of watching competent people do their jobs well in your direction. The Dursleys were not present. Their counsel spoke on their behalf with the flat efficiency of someone managing expectations rather than mounting a defense. Because there was no defense to mount, the evidence record had closed every avenue of plausible deniability before the hearing had even opened. Vernon's counsel submitted a formal statement of mitigating circumstances that cited Vernon's upbringing, his lack of knowledge about magical customs and expectations, and his genuine concern, documented through written records, for the welfare of his household. Amelia Bones, when given the floor to respond, said, "The mitigating circumstances submitted do not address any of the documented incidents. They address the respondent's emotional state, which is not a legal framework this chamber recognizes as mitigation for criminal neglect." She paused. The written records cited as evidence of genuine concern for household welfare consist of 5 letters to Harry Potter's primary school, assuring teachers that Harry was an attention-seeking child who fabricated stories. You would submit that these letters, rather than mitigating the charges, support them. The Wizengamot voted at 2:30 in the afternoon, 44-7. Vernon and Petunia Dursley were convicted of sustained criminal neglect and child endangerment under wizarding law, with parallel findings submitted to the Muggle authorities for processing under their own system. The 7 dissenting votes were, Amelia told Harry afterward, a combination of the genuinely uncertain and the politically motivated, and all 7 would be noted in the public record of the hearing, which she said with a particular satisfaction. Harry stood on the central floor when the verdict was read and felt the thing he'd been expecting to feel all morning, except it wasn't triumph. It was the feeling of something completed. The feeling of a question that had been open his entire life, finally receiving an answer from a source that couldn't be argued with, not because it changed what had happened, but because what had happened was now officially, undeniably, a matter of public record. It had been real, all of it, and the world had seen it. That was enough. The second part of the hearing was the accounting of Dumbledore's placement decision. This was where the room's energy changed. Harry stayed in his chair in the front of the public gallery. Augusta had moved him from the central floor once his testimony was complete, and watched the chamber do something more complicated than it had done for the Dursleys. The Dursleys had been a clear question with a clear answer. Dumbledore was a question that the wizarding world found considerably harder to look at directly, because Dumbledore was the thing the wizarding world had built its post-war confidence on. He sat in the central chair with the composed certainty of a man who has decided, Harry thought, to be honest and let the chips go wherever they go. No performance of remorse, just directness, the same directness Harry had seen in the office meeting when the oratory had dropped away. Amelia questioned him for 40 minutes. She was precise and merciless in the way she was always precise and merciless, not cruel, not grandstanding, just surgically committed to the truth and its full dimensions. She walked Dumbledore through every monitoring flag, every non-action notification, every decision he had made in 11 years to consider the placement confirmed and appropriate. He answered everything. He confirmed that he had known the Dursleys would not be warm to Harry. He confirmed that he had made a calculation that blood protection outweighed the cost of an unhappy home. He confirmed that he had not visited, had not arranged oversight, had relied on monitoring systems that he knew were not designed for sustained welfare checks, and had chosen not to supplement them with anything more specific. He confirmed all of this with the manner of a man paying a debt honestly and without negotiating the terms. "You are the chief warlock of the Wizengamot," Amelia said. "You're the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. You have more institutional power than any individual in the British wizarding world." She looked at him steadily. "And you looked at the monitoring flags and chose not to act 11 separate times. Not because you lacked the power to, not because you lacked the information, but because acting would have complicated the arrangement." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Is there anything you'd like to add?" A pause. He looked at the central floor where Harry had stood that morning, and then looked up at the public gallery where Harry was sitting now, and the look between them lasted only a moment but had the quality of something unambiguous being communicated. "I placed Harry Potter's strategic value above his personal welfare," Dumbledore said to the chamber and to everyone in it, "and I was wrong to do so. I will not insult this chamber or him by suggesting otherwise." The room was very quiet. Several Wizengamot members had the expression of people receiving news they'd half known for years and had hoped would never be formally stated. Griselda Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore for a long moment with an expression that was not anger but was something considerably older and more complicated. "Albus," she said, "you will submit to a formal review of all current arrangements involving persons under your guardianship or care. This review will be conducted by the DMLE, and you will cooperate fully." "Of course," he said, "your positions are not under challenge today. That may change pending the review's findings." She paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes, Griselda, I do." Fudge, sitting in the observer's gallery with an expression of a man who had wanted to be somewhere else for the past 3 hours, had been very quiet throughout. He'd opened his mouth twice during the Dumbledore portion and both times caught Amelia's eye and decided against it, which Harry thought said everything necessary about the current balance of power in the room. The third part of the hearing was Harry's guardianship. This was the part Augusta had prepared him for most specifically, and this was the part that she told him carefully was not guaranteed, that the Wizengamot had discretion over formal magical guardianship assignments, that it was not a simple administrative decision, that there would be Wizengamot members who'd want to assign him to a ministry-approved placement, and there would be political considerations about his public profile and the optics of. "Augusta," Harry had said, "I want to go to the Weasleys." "I know, dear. I want it on record. I want to choose." She'd looked at him over her teacup. "Then we'll make it a formal petition. Your right to express placement preference is protected under Charter Section 19. You're old enough and the circumstances are clear enough that your stated preference carries significant weight. But we need to present it formally, and we need Arthur and Molly to submit their application before the hearing." Arthur and Molly had submitted the application that Monday with a comprehensiveness that suggested Arthur had put every administrative skill he'd developed in 15 years of ministry work toward the document, and Molly had dictated the emotional substance of it with the absolute certainty of someone who has decided how this is going to go. The petition was presented by Augusta, who read the formal components with the practiced authority of someone who has won more family law cases than she has lost, and then said, "Mr. Potter has expressed a clear, uncoerced placement preference for the Weasley family. His right to that preference under the Charter is unambiguous. The Weasley family has submitted a comprehensive application that meets every criterion for ministry-approved guardianship and exceeds several of them. I would invite the chamber to note that following what this boy has endured, the question of where he wants to be and what is good for him might, for once, be considered more important than institutional convenience." She sat down. Tiberius Ogden said, "There are concerns about the visibility of the Potter name in a family setting of this kind. The security implications are, said Amelia Bones with the precise delivery of someone who has prepared for this specific objection, the DMLE's responsibility to manage, not a reason to deny a 12-year-old child a family that wants him. I've already drafted a protection protocol for the property. It's comprehensive. The security objection does not hold. Ogden sat back in his seat with the expression of someone who has run out of road. The vote on guardianship was 48-3. Arthur and Molly Weasley were confirmed as Harry Potter's magical guardians for the duration of his minority, with an annual review and Harry's ongoing right to express preference. From the gallery came a sound that started as a sharp intake of breath from Molly and became, in stages, something that was audible as crying but which Molly would later describe as purely a response to air quality in the chamber. There was a draft. Ron had both fists in the air. Hermione had both hands over her mouth. Ginny was saying something under her breath that was either a prayer or a threat. Harry couldn't determine which from the floor. Fred and George, who had seated themselves in a row with Ron and Hermione and Ginny, simultaneously said yes, without any visible coordination, which was impressive. Harry stood up from his chair on the gallery floor and looked at the Weasley family in the upper gallery, and something in his face did the thing he usually kept it from doing, the thing where what he was feeling went through rather than getting routed around. Molly met his eyes from across the gallery. She nodded once, firm and certain and entirely herself, and he nodded back, and that was the whole of what needed to be said. They were outside in the ministry atrium 20 minutes later, the hearing officially concluded, the formal documents sealed and filed. Arthur was in quiet discussion with Amelia near the fountain, talking through the protection protocol for the borough with the focused competence of a man who is equal parts relieved and extremely practical about what comes next. Dumbledore found Harry near the fountain. He looked smaller out here than he did in official settings, which Harry recognized as probably an illusion. Dumbledore was physically the same person regardless of context. But something about the Wisengamot chamber had stripped away a layer of the monumentality, and what was left was just an old man in robes, standing next to a boy he'd failed, with the full and acknowledged weight of that failure between them. "I imagine you have things you'd like to say," Dumbledore said. "Not particularly," Harry said. And then, because it was true and the day had established that the truth was what got said, "I think you meant well. I think you made a choice that was real, the protection was real, the war was real. I think the part where you went wrong is the part where you decided you were the only one qualified to make it." He looked up at Dumbledore. "The part where you didn't let anyone else check your work." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "That is a precise description of my failing," he said. "I would argue I had reasons, I know." "You had lots of reasons. You'll always have reasons, Professor. You're brilliant at reasons." Harry said it without hostility, just with the particular directness of someone who respects an opponent's capability while refusing to be managed by it. "I'm not telling you this to argue about it. I just want you to know that I know what happened and why, and I'm not going to pretend I don't because it's more comfortable for you." He paused. "And I'm going to need you to understand that whatever war is coming back, and I know it is, I'm not an idiot, I'm not going to be your pawn in it. I'll fight because it's the right thing, not because you've arranged my life so that I have no other option." Something moved in Dumbledore's expression. Not offense, something more like the recognition of a fundamental shift, the registration of a person seeing clearly someone who has been a piece on their board reassembled into an independent actor. "Understood," he said quietly. "Harry, I want you to know that I will do better. Whatever that looks like under the review, whatever changes are required, I will do better." "I know you will," Harry said, "because now there are people watching." He said it simply and left Dumbledore at the fountain and went to find the Weasleys. Ron was waiting for him near the lifts with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who has been extremely patient about not asking questions and is nearly at his limit. "Well," he said. "It's official," Harry said. Ron's face did the thing where he tried not to show how pleased he was, which he was bad at. "So you're like actually officially, yes." "Brilliant," Ron said, with such heartfelt simplicity that Harry laughed, which was something he'd been doing somewhat more since arriving at the Burrow, not dramatically more, just more in the way a houseplant is watered more when it's moved to a window with better light. Hermione appeared from around the pillar she'd been standing behind, doing an extremely poor job of not listening. "Harry, the legal precedent this sets is actually remarkable," she said, pulling out her scroll. "The autonomous evidence broadcast hasn't been successfully used as primary record in a criminal case since Hartley, 1978, which Augusta Longbottom cited, which how is she not on the Wisengamot?" "She should be on the Wisengamot. She was absolutely..." "Hermione," Harry said. "Yes, can we talk about the legal precedent after I've been outside for 5 minutes? She blinked, then she rolled the scroll up. "Yes, obviously, sorry," a pause. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Harry said. "Actually, yes." She looked at him for a moment with the specific attention of someone who is very good at assessing the truth of a statement, and then she nodded in a way that suggested she'd performed the assessment and was satisfied. "Good," she said, with the quiet warmth she usually kept tucked under the academic efficiency. The three of them went outside into the London afternoon. which was doing the thing London afternoons do in August, bright and warm and faintly noisy, with the city going about its entirely unconcerned business. The ministry building's muggle-repelling charms meant they emerged onto a quiet side street, and for a moment they stood on the pavement in the August light and said nothing. "Chips," Ron said. "Absolutely," Harry said. The borough that evening was a different kind of occasion than any occasion Harry had experienced in that house in the preceding week. Molly had been cooking since the hearing ended, which meant she'd had approximately 4 hours, which meant the kitchen table had expanded. Literally, she'd charmed it larger, and was covered with more food than could be accounted for by even the generous headcount of people present. Arthur had invited Arthur's brothers, and Percy had come, and at some point the Weasley family's orbit had expanded to include Augusta Longbottom, who appeared with a bottle of wine and the air of someone who had earned it, and Hermione's parents had been called and had decided their daughter having dinner with a friend on a significant evening was worth the drive to Devon. The noise was extraordinary. The magical clock ticked, the radio played, someone had strung lights through the kitchen enchantment style, and they moved slowly through warm colors, which was either Fred or George's work. The gnomes in the garden had been displaced by the back door being left open and had retreated to the cabbage beds, where they muttered in outraged gnomish. Percy was explaining something to Mr. Granger, who was listening with the specific expression of a man who has decided to suspend normal epistemological standards for the evening and just go with it. Harry sat at the table and let it happen around him. He was not, he noticed, making himself small. He wasn't managing his presence with the careful calibration of someone who has learned that drawing too much attention in certain directions causes certain kinds of pain. He was just sitting there at a table that was full of people who were there because they wanted to be, taking up exactly as much space as he needed. It was a small thing. It was, he thought, everything. Ginny appeared beside him with 2 pieces of Molly's sponge cake, the 4-layer one, which had eventually been finished and which turned out to be extraordinary, the kind of cake that suggests the baker has been conducting ongoing personal research on the subject of excellence. "You were good today," she said, sitting down next to him. "I watched the whole thing. You didn't flinch at any of it." "Neither did you," Harry said. "That man in the second tier was being awful and you sat perfectly still." "I was counting to very large numbers," Ginny said serenely. "It helps," Harry smiled. "I'll remember that." She handed him the larger piece of cake, which he accepted, and they ate cake side by side at the table, and around them the burrow was exactly what it was, slightly chaotic, warm, full to overflowing with people who spoke over each other and argued about Quidditch and told stories and asked too many questions, and filled every room they occupied with the comfortable, careless evidence of being alive. Augusta Longbottom appeared at Harry's other side with her glass of wine, and sat down with the air of someone who has completed a day's work to a high standard and is entirely at peace with the results. 48-3, she said. 48-3, Harry agreed. She raised her glass. He raised his pumpkin juice. They clinked with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. "Neville will be pleased to hear you're settled," she said. "He mentions you in his letters, says you're kind to him in potions when Snape is," she paused, choosing a word, "himself." "Neville's good at herbology," Harry said. "He just needs someone to notice that doesn't make him useless at everything else." Augusta gave him the look she'd been giving him at intervals since they'd first met, the one that said she had revised her assessment upward and was not embarrassed about it. "You'll be good for this family," she said, "and they'll be good for you." "I know," Harry said, and then, because the day had established that certainty was allowed, "I knew when I got here." Later, when the dinner had wound down and the Granger parents had departed, and the table had been charmed back to its normal size, and Molly was washing up with a contentment that made the whole kitchen feel lighter, Harry sat in the living room with Ron and Hermione and the fire going, because August in Devon could still do with a fire in the evenings, and the Weasleys had decided to never be cold if they could help it. They were sitting in comfortable silence, the kind that only develops between people who have been through something together and don't need to perform their ease with each other. Ron was sketching chess positions. Hermione was reading a book she'd found on Augusta's recommended list, something about the intersection of wizarding and Muggle legal systems that she'd been wanting to track down since the hearing. Harry had his feet up on the footstool that Molly had pointed him toward with the air of someone who considers footstool allocation a form of love language. "Next year's going to be interesting," Ron said, not looking up from his chess diagram. "It's always interesting," Harry said. "More interesting than last year, interesting, or same amount." Harry thought about the Chamber of Secrets rumor that had been circulating at the end of term. He thought about what he knew of the wizarding world's patterns, the way trouble had a way of finding the year he was in it and making itself comfortable. He thought about Dumbledore's review, the ongoing investigation, the changes moving through the ministry like weather. "Different," he said. "Things are going to be different." Hermione looked up from her book. "Different how? People know now about Privet Drive, about what Dumbledore did, about all of it. That changes things. How people look at everything," he considered. "How I show up." "How you show up," Ron repeated with the tone of someone who hasn't quite unpacked the statement. "I've spent my whole life being careful." About what I do with magic, about how much space I take up, about, he gestured vaguely, all of it. I was trained out of it before I even knew what it was. He looked at the fire. I'm done with that. Ron looked up from his chess diagram now, and the look he gave Harry was not confused or worried, just a friend seeing something and recognizing it, the way you recognize something you've been waiting to see. Good, he said with the same heartfelt simplicity he'd used outside the lifts that afternoon. You should write up what you just said, Hermione said, with the specific energy of someone who has an idea forming and is deploying it before it fully arrives. The bit about being trained out of it, there's actually a body of research on magical suppression in hostile environments, how early trauma affects core magical expression, how the magic learns to, Hermione, Ron said. I know, she said, later, much later. Fine, Harry smiled at the fire. Outside, the Devon night was doing its quiet Devon things, owls and wind and the distant sound of the village, and beyond it the fields going dark and the stars coming out over all of it, indifferent and permanent and enormous. He had ground beneath his feet. He felt it the way you feel something structural, not dramatically, not as a single moment, but as the accumulated fact of several days of decisions made by people who had decided that he was worth deciding for. Arthur and Molly, Amelia and Augusta. Griselda Marchbanks calling for a vote and getting 48 out of 51. Ron with his fists in the air in the gallery, Ginny and the large numbers she counted to when things were unfair. Hermione with her scroll of notes that was, Harry knew, an act of care disguised as research. He had ground and he had people, and the boy who had spent 11 years making himself small in a cupboard under the stairs at Privet Drive was not gone but was something else now, something that had always been there, waiting for the moment the space cleared enough to be it. His magic settled in his chest like something at rest after a long labor, was warm and patient and entirely uninterested in being manageable. He let it be. The Daily Prophet ran the story the next morning. Front page, full account, evidence record cited, Wisengamot vote and result published in the public record below the fold. Dursleys convicted, Potter guardianship transferred in landmark ruling, Dumbledore faces DMLE review. Molly read it at the kitchen table and set it down and didn't say anything, which meant she was processing something she didn't yet have words for. Arthur read it and nodded once, the nod of a man who works in systems and understands what it means when a system works. Harry read it over breakfast with Hedwig on his shoulder and a piece of toast in his hand and the burrow making its morning sounds around him, and he read it to the end, and then he folded the paper and put it on the table and ate the rest of his toast. It was strange to see himself talked about in the third person in a document that was entirely about him. He'd been talked about in the third person his whole life, the boy who lived, that Dursley boy, the Potter child, always described, always defined from the outside, always a noun in someone else's sentence. This was different. This story was his, the evidence was his magic's evidence, the testimony was his, the choice of placement was his. The 48-3 was something that had been done for him, not to him, a distinction so unfamiliar that it still occasionally required a moment to register. He looked up from the table. Ginny was reading the Quidditch results at the other end of it, upside down and apparently fine with this. Fred and George were debating something in low voices that suggested it was either a business proposal or a plot, and the distinction between these two things was increasingly theoretical. Ron was eating his body weight in eggs with the cheerful focus of a person at peace with his breakfast. Molly set a fresh pot of tea in front of Harry without being asked. There. That was the word he'd been looking for. Not safe, not warm, not the various words he'd tried on over the past week that each got partway to the thing and didn't quite arrive. There. The feeling of being in the right place, of having arrived, of the long disorientation of not having anywhere that was yours finally, simply ending. He was there. More toast? Molly asked. Yes, please, Harry said. And the burrow went on being exactly what it was, and the Devon morning came through the windows in its long golden way, and Hedwig clicked her beak softly against his ear, and somewhere in the Ministry of Magic a filing system held an unalterable record that said what had happened and who had done it and what it had cost, and Amelia Bones was already at her desk at 7 in the morning beginning the next stage of the review. And Albus Dumbledore was sitting in his office at Hogwarts with his hands folded and his cold tea and the full, honest weight of his accounting. Harry poured his tea and looked out the window at the fields, and the fields were green and still in the morning, and he thought about September and Hogwarts and what it would mean to go back this year with this year behind him. He thought, whatever comes next, I know what I am. He drank his tea. The clock on the wall showed every hand in the home position, every member of the family accounted for and present, and there were 8 hands now instead of 7, and the clock ticked on steady and unhurried and entirely sure of itself. Outside, the gnomes were causing trouble in the cabbage beds. The burrow didn't mind, it had room.